Building 69, which is the beginning of the hospital, called the infirmary back then. The building was actually built in a square with wards on three sides. Building 69 itself was the headquarters for the hospital, and in the middle of the square, it was open. It was grass, and it had magnolia trees planted in there. Oh, the blooms just were wonderful. They smelled in the spring. And they had picnic tables and benches in the middle of the hospital in this quadrangle. And there were entrances to the quadrangle from all three wards on the three sides. And if you had a veteran who maybe was a bit demented and would tend to wander, they could put him in the quadrangle and he could sit out there and enjoy himself, and they wouldn't have to worry about him wandering off. The staff had their lunches out there. It was just like a little park inside the hospital. They had a fountain there. The fountain has now been moved up to the clock tower, but the fountain at one time was in the middle of the hospital in this courtyard, and with the water running all the time, it was just a perfect place to come out, and staff used it as a place to take a small respite during the day. Yeah, it was the headquarters, and they built out from that to the four sides, but they built 69 first and then the others. And there's some pictures in the hallways in the hospital of the early construction and showing that they used that sort of park in the middle as a storage area for building material as they built the four sides. Oh yeah, there was a full-size baseball field down inside the cemetery. The cemetery was around it, and the domiciliary fielded its own team. It was called the Soldiers, and they played teams from Bristol, Johnson City, and out of the area. The other teams would travel here and play on our home field. Mountain Home began to change in about 1917, 1918, at the end of the First World War. There was a Spanish flu, the influenza, and there was tuberculosis. Both of them became prominent during that period of time. And rather than it continuing to just be a soldier's home, it began the conversion to a major medical facility. A lot of Dom residents were moved out to other domiciliaries in the country to make room for these veterans coming back from World War I who had lung problems. The thought at the time, medical-wise, was that the best treatment for tuberculosis and the flu was fresh air and sunshine. And the best place for that, as far as government-owned facilities was concerned, was Mountain Home. Its elevation, its cool mountain air, they sent them here by the drove. They built big porches on the back, screened them in, and a lot of the men slept on those porches for the fresh air. So domiciliary patients the number was reduced as they moved them out to other domiciliaries, and medically needy veterans were starting to be admitted to the Dom buildings. So anyhow, that began the change for Mountain Home from transitioning from a soldier's home to a medical facility. And it continued through to World War II, and then Korea, and then Vietnam. And the domiciliary got smaller and smaller, and the medical facility got bigger and bigger. Until today, of course, the domiciliary is just 100 beds and housed in Building 160, and all of the old domiciliary barracks are now converted to medical school use. And our association with the Quillen College of Medicine. So one of the things that really helped the care of veterans here at Mountain Home was the fact that we helped develop a medical school and invited it here on campus so that those people that are learning medicine and other nursing and such as that are now being trained here at Mountain Home and are a benefit to the veterans who stay here. And of course, Building 160 was built in 1993, and we moved 700 veterans out of the old domiciliary barracks and moved them to Building 160. And early on, it became, in 1993, it became the Dom. And then slowly, the medical school and the needs of the hospital became greater, and so they reduced the size of the Dom and increased the size of outpatient primary care. There were 8 soldiers' homes that were built across the nation starting in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln had called for a better way of caring for Civil War veterans. And of course, he was assassinated, but Congress took up his cause and started building soldiers' homes. And the interesting thing at that time with the mood of the nation was that the South was a rebel. And so nothing was provided for Southern soldiers. All these homes were going to be provided for Union soldiers. And so they were built mostly in the North. There was one home built in the South, and that was at Hampton, Virginia. And that was primarily built for black soldiers who fought for the Union. And Congress at the time thought that all the blacks were from the South, so they would be used to the Southern climate, so they built a home in Virginia. Congressman Preston Brownlow, who was our congressman from the 1st District, got concerned that there was nothing for Union soldiers who fought from the South. And so he appealed to Congress and said he made 3 points. One was that there was a home for Union soldiers in Virginia who had not one volunteer soldier of record for the Union. Second was Tennessee provided 30,000 Union soldiers, and of those, 18,000 lived in East Tennessee and had pensions from Union service. And his third point was that Congress had just allocated $1 million to build a federal prison in Atlanta. And he made the point, he said, don't you think that Union soldiers deserve at least as much as convicts? And with those points, Congress agreed to build a 9th home. And they left it up to the congressman to decide where to put it. Well, he consulted with the Board of Governors. They had a Board of Governors in Washington that managed the homes. And he consulted with them, and they agreed to come to East Tennessee and look and to see where they might build a home. Well, the congressman went first to Greenville. Greenville was a bigger city, if you will, than Johnson City. And the congressman lived in Jonesboro, which is between Johnson City and Greenville. So he went to Greenville first and said, we're going to build a soldier's home and we're going to have a federal courthouse. Which would you rather have? And the city fathers of Greenville said, oh, we'd rather have a federal courthouse. It'll bring more people to Greenville. So he came to Johnson City and he asked Johnson City, and they said absolutely. So he brought the Board of Governors from Washington on the train, and they came to Johnson City. And the city fathers of Johnson City wanted it on the east end where the Gump Edition and all that is out there. That was their pick. And the Board of Governors came and looked at it, and they looked at some other areas, and they hadn't really fully made up their mind till the day they were scheduled to leave. They got on a train and they came down this track behind Mountain Home, and they looked up on this hill and they said, there's where we ought to place the home, where everybody can see it, high on that hill. And so they agreed, and they began to try to contact the farmers that owned this land to see if they'd be willing to sell. And one of the largest landowners was a guy named Joseph Lyle, and they approached him, and land at that time, at the most, was going for probably $1 an acre. And the government offered him $50 an acre. And of course, he immediately agreed to sell. And so did the others. There were some other Lyles that owned land up here, and a family called Miller who owned land, and they bought 270 acres, I think. Interesting enough, though, Joseph Lyle fought for the Confederacy and was not allowed to use the facilities after he sold his land here. Lyle was an interesting character. He joined the Confederacy, having gone to school one day in an academy down in Jonesboro. And the Confederate cavalry came by one day recruiting. And all the boys in that school, teenagers, had rode their own horses to school. And they joined up, signed the papers, and rode off that day without even going home. It wasn't but about 3 or 4 days later that Joe's father found him in Knoxville. He had to ride the train down there and brought him some clothes and some shoes. All of those boys ended up in the Confederacy. And Joe was captured at Petersburg and taken to Philadelphia, to an island off of the river there called Pea Island. And it's called Pea Island because a boat wreck there one time was loaded with peas. And all the seeds floated over to the island, and the island was covered with peas. So the Union started out as one of their POW camps. And Joe was there until Appomattox. And after Appomattox, he was freed. And it took him months to get back home because all the railroads in the South were ripped up. He said he finally, after about 3 or 4 months, finally caught a train in Knoxville and rode it to Jonesboro and jumped off the train and walked home. Because you're supposed to, if you were a Confederate soldier, you had to have that piece of paper that said that you had rejoined the Union. And if you didn't have it, you could be jailed. And of course, the Union had a military unit that was in Jonesboro. So he jumped the train just before they got to Jonesboro and walked back to Limestone to his mama's house, and said he walked in as the sun was coming up. He walked on the back porch and walked in, and his mother fainted. He was barefoot, his clothes were rags, and it was November. They had rode the top of the boxcars all the way from Knoxville. He said it was nearly frozen. But poor old Joe couldn't use the facility because he was a Confederate, and Confederates were not entertained in here until much, much later after the war. So anyhow, Congressman Brownlow got the money appropriated, got $2 million appropriated, worked with the city father. They hired a prominent architect out of New York, and he drew up the plans, and it was really drawn up as sort of a park-like atmosphere with lots of open land, trees, and of course he included a theater and a chapel and the barrack headquarters building and the infirmary. It had its own water system, had its own sewer system, and it had its own electric lights with a steam plant. So it had a lot of the modern things that weren't available in Johnson City. And as it was built, it was 2 miles out of Johnson City. So the city fathers, along with a private company, built a trolley track from Johnson City out to Mountain Home, which was in 1910 was extended over across to East Tennessee State Normal School, which was a teacher's college at the time in 1910. So the trolley went from Johnson City through Mountain Home over to the college and then back into Johnson City. So there was always a fence, and there were guards on the gates. They were on the gates till the 40s, I think. And when the bus came on, or the trolley early on and then the bus later, the guards would stop it and get on and check, because any veterans who came back intoxicated were taken off and put in our jail. Yeah, early on they were allowed beer.